My name is Evelyn Mercer, and the man who thought he could humiliate me with a 2-line email had no idea I quietly owned more than half the company he was trying to impress. He sent it on a Friday afternoon, right when the plant was slowing for the weekend. But the humiliation moved faster than production schedules ever did. I had not even opened my inbox before one of the floor supervisors walked toward me with the expression people wear when they have just watched a collision happen in real time. 19 years of my life had been compressed into 2 cold sentences and copied to 16 people like I was office furniture being reassigned to another corner. The email informed me that my position as Director of Operations was being restructured to reflect the company's commitment to forward-thinking leadership rather than legacy habits. Legacy habits. I read those words standing beside my truck in the October wind, while hydraulic oil still clung faintly to my jacket sleeves. Then I read the rest. My salary was being cut from $210,000 to $136,000 effective immediately. My duties would be reassigned under the supervision of Caleb Whitmore, age 27, nephew of our executive chairwoman, and newly invented Chief Transformation Officer. The board had never approved that title. His aunt had simply handed it to him like car keys. I did not answer the email, not because I had nothing to say, because I knew exactly when speaking would matter. I had entered Blackridge Agricultural Systems at 35 years old. I learned every station in Bay 1 within 6 months. I worked line failures at 2 in the morning. I learned how to hear pressure instability before gauges confirmed it. I spent years standing beside people whose overtime disappeared whenever production stopped. Nothing about my career came through bloodlines. I climbed through long shifts, burned weekends, and machinery loud enough to shake your bones. Caleb Whitmore had an MBA, 6 months at a consulting startup in Nashville, and a habit of using words like optimization while standing far away from the people who actually built things. He called 2 decades of operational experience legacy habits. The phrase would have been funny if it had not been so arrogant. But what Caleb never understood was that while I had spent 19 years helping run the company, I had also spent 19 years quietly buying it. That part began with Arthur Bennett. Arthur had co-founded Blackridge alongside Samuel Whitmore decades earlier. By the time I arrived, Samuel was dead, and Arthur was already in his 70s. But he still walked the floor every Thursday morning, not for show. He stopped at stations long enough to actually see what people were doing. In my second year, he watched me reorganize a hydraulic pressure sequence to reduce defect rates. Most executives would have nodded politely and kept moving. Arthur stood there studying the process for almost 5 minutes before asking why I moved the pressure test earlier in assembly. I explained the failure pattern. He listened carefully, reached into his coat pocket, and handed me a silver pen, engraved. On the side were 5 words. Own what you build, Evelyn. That pen changed my life. Arthur died 4 years later, but the sentence stayed with me. After that, every bonus I earned went into the employee stock purchase program. Most people took the money home. I never judged them. Life is expensive. Families need things, but I kept buying shares. Quarter after quarter, year after year, then came the private purchases. A retiring procurement executive wanted liquidity for a ranch in Montana. I bought his shares through my attorney at full market value. 3 years later, another executive retired, then the former CFO, then a longtime plant manager. Every transaction was documented. Every transfer legally filed. 5%, 10%, 25.40. Eventually, majority control. The filing sat publicly available in SEC records under Mercer Holdings Trust for 17 straight years. I never hid anything. I simply never announced myself to people arrogant enough to assume nobody else could own the room. The man who protected all of it was Daniel Cross, my college friend from Purdue, and later a securities attorney. Daniel believed documents were walls, not paper. He built the trust structure during my second year at Blackridge. He tracked every threshold crossing, every filing deadline, every purchase agreement years earlier over black coffee at a roadside diner off Route 18. He showed me Article 7 of the Corporate Charter. A protection clause. If a controlling shareholder's compensation, authority, or duties were altered unilaterally without written consent, emergency board intervention could immediately be triggered. Daniel called it my insurance policy. He hoped I would never need it. Life rarely asks what we hope for. By the Friday Caleb sent that email, my ownership position stood at 51% of Blackridge Agricultural Systems. At current valuation, it was worth roughly $340 million. I know that number sounds absurd for a woman who still repaired her own fence hinges and drove an old pickup truck to work every day, but ownership does not have to look glamorous. It only has to exist. Caleb had copied 16 employees while demoting the controlling shareholder of the company. Worse, he had done it using a title the board had never legally ratified. He had accidentally detonated the exact charter provision Daniel warned me about years earlier. I sat in my truck for 3 minutes, looking at the photograph clipped behind the visor. My husband, Michael, laughing at our daughter's middle school graduation. Michael had died 5 years earlier in a car accident while I was trapped at the plant, managing a catastrophic hydraulic failure that could have destroyed $11 million in equipment. I missed his last 2 days alive. I still carry that weight. After he died, I stopped believing security came from titles or praise. I believed in documents, ownership, protection. No arrogant executive could erase with a keyboard. I called Daniel from the parking lot. He answered on the first ring. I read the email aloud exactly as written. He stayed quiet for several seconds before asking one question. What's the status of the equity sale? Margaret Whitmore had been negotiating a major outside investment deal with a private equity fund. If completed, it could potentially dilute my control position below majority ownership. They were 72 hours from closing. That was when I understood Caleb's email was not just stupidity. It sat beside a much larger power move. Daniel immediately drafted the Article 7 filing. By 6:30 that evening, emergency shareholder action had been formally submitted on behalf of Mercer Holdings Trust, beneficial owner of 51% of issued shares. The filing triggered 2 things simultaneously: an emergency board session within 36 hours and an automatic freeze on any major equity transaction until resolution. Margaret's private equity deal died before her. Lawyers could even search for loopholes. Slept well that night, not because I felt victorious, because I was tired. Some battles begin with shouting. This one began with paperwork. Corporate Secretary Linda Graves opened the filing during dinner at her desk Friday evening. She read the first paragraph twice before calling General Counsel Richard Hale. Richard went home that night, opened the SEC database, and started searching Mercer Holdings Trust. Transfer records, quarterly purchases, ownership disclosures, contracts. 17 years of filings, 49 pages, perfectly documented. He later admitted his hands started shaking halfway through printing them. Not because anything looked suspicious, because everything was too complete. Richard called Margaret Whitmore near midnight. He told her nephew had signed an unauthorized restructuring action against the controlling shareholder of the company. At first, she thought he misunderstood something. Then Richard explained the rest: my ownership position, the invalidity of Caleb's title, the charter violation, the frozen equity transaction, the fact that all of it had been publicly documented for years. Margaret asked one question: did Caleb know? Richard said no. Meanwhile, Caleb was on LinkedIn, congratulating himself for making hard decisions necessary for transformation. He used the phrase, clearing the path for the next chapter. By morning, screenshots of that post sat inside Daniel's evidence appendix. Saturday morning, my phone filled with missed calls. Caleb called repeatedly. Margaret's office called. Richard called. I returned only Daniel's. The board meeting was confirmed for Thursday morning. The 3 directors who originally opposed Caleb's appointment were already prepared to vote against him. The outside investment fund had backed away completely. The legal hold was airtight. I spent the afternoon replacing the hinge on my back gate, because small ordinary tasks sometimes help you remember life still belongs to you. Then I drove to the Route 18 diner. Black coffee, turkey sandwich, farmers at the counter discussing weather patterns. Nobody in that building knew a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars was about to discover the woman they humiliated already owned it. That evening I sat in my kitchen looking at Michael's photograph on the refrigerator and thinking about how I had never told him the full extent of my ownership. Maybe I was afraid speaking it aloud would make it easier to lose. Thursday morning, I wore the charcoal suit Michael once picked out for me at a department store in Springfield. He told me it looked like the kind of suit worn by a woman who did not need permission to enter any room. Before leaving, I opened my desk drawer and picked up Arthur Bennett's silver pen. Own what you build, Evelyn. I slipped it into my jacket pocket. The boardroom sat behind thick glass doors on the top floor. Daniel was already seated with a heavily tabbed file beside him. Richard Hale stood near the presentation screen, looking exhausted. Linda Graves prepared meeting minutes quietly against the wall. The directors entered one by one. Margaret arrived near the end. Caleb walked in behind her, carrying his MacBook and the confidence of a man expecting an administrative discussion instead of a corporate execution. He looked at me, sitting beside Daniel, and hesitated slightly. Probably the first moment he realized I did not look like someone under discipline. Richard opened the meeting without pleasantries. This session has been convened under Article 7 regarding unilateral action affecting the compensation and duties of a majority shareholder. The word majority changed the oxygen in the room. Caleb's expression twitched. Richard presented the filings carefully. 17 years of documented ownership. Quarterly employee stock purchases. Private share acquisitions. SEC disclosures. Contracts. Voting rights. No gaps. No concealment. No procedural errors. Then he addressed Caleb's title. Chief Transformation Officer had never been approved by board resolution. It existed only through Margaret's executive memo, meaning Caleb possessed no legal authority to restructure any employee, even before considering the fact that the employee he targeted owned 51% of the company. Caleb finally spoke. That can't be right, Daniel answered calmly. 49 pages of filings say otherwise. Then he added the final exhibit, Caleb's LinkedIn post. Intent documented in his own words. I barely spoke during the meeting. I did not need to. The paperwork spoke better than anger ever could. When the vote came, The room became silent enough to hear the air system overhead reverse all restructuring actions. Terminate Caleb Whitmore, effective immediately. Appoint Evelyn Mercer, interim CEO, pending transition review. The first 3 votes came quickly, then the others, one by one. Each yes sounded like steel locking into place. When Richard reached Margaret, the room stopped breathing. She looked at Caleb for a long time, not angrily, sadly, like someone finally understanding that love had clouded judgment. Then she looked at me and quietly said, "Yes, 8-0, unanimous." Caleb stared around the room, waiting for someone to rescue him from consequences. Nobody did. Finally, he looked at me and asked why I never answered his email. I told him the truth. You wanted me to defend myself in front of 16 people. I didn't owe you a reaction. I owed myself a lawful ending. Security entered moments later. Richard instructed Caleb to leave company equipment behind. For legal review, he started to object, then looked toward Margaret. She said nothing. That silence told him everything. 2 hours later, I officially became CEO of Blackridge Agricultural Systems. No applause. No dramatic speeches, just signatures. Dry legal paperwork capable of changing an entire life. Within 60 days, Caleb faced a $22 million fiduciary interference lawsuit connected to the attempted restructuring and frozen equity transaction. His LinkedIn post became Exhibit AI did not celebrate. I did not need revenge. I needed the company returned to people who understood what built it. Margaret resigned from the board 8 days later. Her resignation letter was 1 paragraph long. I respected her too much to turn her into a villain. She had helped build the company beside Samuel Whitmore for decades. But she allowed family loyalty to override governance. That mistake carried a price. The first thing I did as CEO was not launch a transformation initiative or hire consultants to rename departments. I went down to Bay 1. I stood beside the line with Carol Jennings, discussing shipping schedules, defect rates, and hydraulic testing failures. Some workers looked at me differently after hearing the news. Yesterday, they thought I was a director being demoted. Today, they learned I was the controlling shareholder and CEO. But I did not want lowered eyes. I wanted honest ones. I told them the line still mattered. The work still mattered. The people doing the real labor would never be called obsolete just because someone needed impressive vocabulary for social media. Caleb thought the future was presentations. Arthur Bennett understood what I understand now. The future is equipment that does not fail in a farmer's field. A production line that survives pressure. Workers who go home respected. I still keep Arthur's silver pen in the top drawer of my desk, not as a lucky charm, as evidence. Because some advice is so correct, it takes 20 years to fully understand its power. When someone dismisses your life's work as legacy, sometimes they are only admitting they lack the patience to recognize value built slowly. And if you ever find yourself underestimated by people speaking louder than they understand, remember this. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is preparation. Friday was the day Caleb thought he had reduced me to a line item in an email. The following Thursday was the day an entire boardroom learned who actually owned the company.